to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to a new episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I am very pleased to be joined by my co-hosts, Leigh and Devonya Havis, and today we are going to be talking about judgment. Not one of my strong suits. But before we get to that, I would like to get some drink orders and some rants or raves. So, Rick, let me go to you first.
Today, I am going to have a margarita, and I am ranting about the TV series Suits. So I know I'm a little late to this bandwagon of people jumping back on Suits lately and so on. I gotta tell you, I thought I liked that series when it was first on, but my God, is it stupid. The law firm is constantly in crisis. It's the same crisis. I'm willing to suspend belief, but I'm not willing to make myself an idiot.
All right, Devonya, you're up. What are you drinking and what are you ranting or raving about this week?
Well, I think today I'm going to have a mocktail that is a little bit of ginger and mint. I had it at a local restaurant and it was pretty darn good. And I can't remember the name of the mocktail, so we'll just go with generic mint basil mocktail.
We'll call it the Havis.
Yes, yes.
I like that. I like that. Today, I'm going to rave about comfort food. I just felt the urge to talk about the genuine benefits of food we love that makes us feel good and having access to it. I don't have anything more profound to say about my rave.
What about you, Leigh?
I'm just going to have a hot toddy today. It is cold, cold, cold in Memphis.
Is it Memphis cold or is it really cold?
No, it's Memphis cold.
And snow?
Well, flurries, you have to look hard to see it, but a little bit, yeah. And I'm raving today about the Netflix film Kneecap. So Kneecap tells the true story of young guys in Northern Ireland who form a rap trio, actually. And in the course of doing so, forward their cause of bringing back the Irish language to music and, of course, fighting all of the battles and struggles of Northern Ireland against their occupation. It is absolutely well done. I highly recommend this. Kneecap on Netflix, just released in the last couple of months. So, Rick, I know we're talking about judgment today. What did you have in mind?
Judgment is an interesting topic because there didn't seem always to be a place for the concept of judgment in philosophy. For Aristotle, we don't need judgment because you could know something like the log is white, and that doesn't require a separate thing judging that the log is white. And then in moral philosophy, for Aristotle, you don't need to judge something as being good because there too, you have a kind of knowledge of it. But in the Middle Ages, a separation was made between the act of apprehending something, let's say Socrates is human, and then judging that Socrates is human, because that second was thought to pertain to an actually existing state of affairs. The first one, the act of apprehending, just pertained to understanding. But then things get much more complicated with Kant, who treated judgment extensively in the Critique of Pure Reason, and then he wrote an entire book devoted to the power of judging. Now, if we look at the way normal people talk, judgment seems to have, I think, three kind of spheres. There's a moral sphere where we make judgments concerning what is good, a political sphere where we make judgments concerning what is the best for all or for most, and then this knowledge sphere where our judgments concern what is actually the case. So we speak of someone exercising good judgment when they have a knack for getting things right and doing the right thing. But we also speak of judgment when the facts aren't clear or aren't entirely clear. Does human experience need something like judgment? And if so, in what cases and for what purposes? So this week, we're getting all judgy up here in the hotel bar.
This episode is brought to you by our good friends at Edinburgh University Press, who have an amazing slate of new philosophy texts coming out in 2025. Make sure to visit their website at euppublishing.com, and don't forget to type in the special discount code for our listeners, HBS, when you check out. Thanks, Edinburgh University Press, for supporting public-facing philosophy.
Maybe I made things too confusing by talking about all these different ways in which we talk about judgment and the spheres in which it's used. So I'm going to start with one of Leigh's favorite questions, namely, what is judgment? Is there something that all of these ways have in common, or we just happen to use the same word for different things? So I guess what I'm asking is, what is judgment, and is there something common among all these cases that we use?
Well, I think one thing that we find consistent among many of these cases, although not all of these cases, is that judgment is a kind of faculty of thinking, and thinking the particular under the universal, right? I mean, this is borrowing from Kant's idea of determinate judgment, right? But it's the ability to apply general concepts or principles to specific instances. And that's central to human cognition because it enables us to make sense of particular experiences using general rules or categories. Now, obviously, there are differences and changes in that understanding of judgment, but I do think in the man on the street terms, or as you say, the civilian terms, that's generally how we think about judgment.
So at first I thought, well, that's not the case with moral judgments, but the more I think about it, it actually is the case with moral judgments, because I look at you and you're saying something and I'm like, that's a lie and that's wrong. And in that sense, I'm using two universals. First, your statement belongs to the group of statements called lies. And secondly, lies belong to the group of things that are morally wrong.
Right.
And so I think you're right. Then I'm subsuming what you're doing under a universal and judging that this is an instance of that.
And also judging that the particular sets of lies that you're telling have a moral valence, right?
Yeah.
So when you think about lying, in the case of my Aunt May and the dress that she spent hours and hours to make, I'm not going to tell Aunt May that this is an ugly dress. And yet to tell her that the dress is interesting or provocative is not considered to be problematic in the same way that certain kinds of lies are morally problematic. So I would concur that there is this application of universals in the particular. And maybe to complicate the conversation a little bit more, to think in terms of how ancient philosophers delineate the sets of skills required to apply the universal in a particular case. And I'm thinking here of the distinction between practical wisdom and broader universal knowledge, so that there is some capacity, some cognitive discernment that does separate judgment from simply thinking. It separates judgment from simply observing something and noting what happens to be appearing to us.
So let me ask this question. If judgment is the act of subsuming a particular under a universal, why do I need this thing called judgment? Why can't I just say, I know Socrates is human? Not I judge Socrates to be human, but I just know that Socrates is human, like I know that it is cloudy today. Am I judging that it's cloudy today?
But we want to make a distinction between subsumption and applying. So how do we apply a universal concept to something in the particular or the immediate? And I think that is where there's slippage and a requirement for a certain kind of discernment that we seem to lean toward calling judgment here. You can look at the sky and say it's cloudy. It may rain, but it's not necessarily raining. So in your judgment of these events that happen when the sky is cloudy, one might make some kind of determination or discernment about possibilities for rain, for example. That seems to me very different than the way I'm going to assess lies.
I like that example, Devonya, because I think judgment has to include something in excess of what's just given in our broad sense experience. I might be able to look up in the sky and say it's cloudy, But if I were to say, it looks like it's going to rain, that's a judgment, right? That's subsuming a particular or deducing really a particular from a universal. One of the things that I might want to raise is whether or not judgment is only the capacity of what we might call conscious things. So one of the things I was thinking about this morning was, what would it be like to not have judgment as a faculty of my understanding or a faculty of my thinking? Because I think probably non-human animals judge things, fish and whales and dolphins judge things, but I don't think trees and plants and rocks judge things. I don't think that it's just about can something perceive or does something have a sensory connection to the outside world. It is a very specific kind of cognitive capacity.
So let me bust out a medieval example about animals. If a bunch of cows are in a pasture and a wolf comes into the pasture, the cows run. Are the cows judging, this is a wolf, wolves eat us, run? Or is it just sense perception, as you were saying before, Leigh, and therefore there's nothing like judgment involved in that? Here, I'm not saying it's just pure instinct, but what I'm saying is that there is just perception, and there's no act beyond the perception that the animals have.
I mean, of course, the most obvious response to that is, how would we know? Right. I can't communicate with wolves, so I don't know if when they see something that is a danger to them and they decide to run, that they have subsumed a particular under a general rule. It looks like that to me, so it looks like a good judgment. But, I mean, how would we know?
Well, and I also wonder, how do we know about ourselves, right? So we say, oh, no, we're doing this other thing that animals don't do. But this might be a case where we're imputing to ourselves something that is a behavior just like the animals engage in. And we're saying, oh, but we're doing this thing called judging, and they don't.
Right. But I kind of assumed from your question that you were asking, is running from a predator the same as, for example, when I touch a hot stove and I jerk my hand back,
right?
Which I don't think is a judgment.
Although it is a judgment that the next time you see a stove, you're not going near it.
Yeah.
Right.
Or a wolf.
But I want to think that recognition of danger involves something akin to what we're trying to describe as judgment. That you have to understand danger as a universal concept, and that this particular thing that is appearing falls into the category of danger, and distinguishing danger from food or comfort. And I'm thinking here about the ways that trees communicate in combination, that they actually send out chemical responses when other trees in their group are under threat. So I'm wondering if this instinctual or biological response is actually something akin to judgment, even for non-human kin.
Well, I think you kind of put your finger on it in that very first claim that you made when you talked about the recognition of danger, the recognition of danger. Like, I think that is a maybe not well-founded, but definitely widespread assumption when we talk about judgment, is that there's some kind of reflection going on there. There's pure sensory analysis of a situation, but then a reflection on, and again, the application of a rule to the particular situation. Right. A universal rule.
Right. I mean, if we look at German, and I can make a similar, although more complicated argument in relation to Latin, judgment has to do with differentiation. So the German word is Urteil, and Teilen is the German word for separating or cutting or putting into pieces. Discernment is a Latin word that means a similar thing, like separating things, putting them into categories, pulling them apart. Now, in order for me to separate two things that aren't given as separate in the experience I'm having, I need to reflect. I need to have some other experience. I have to do this kind of comparison and say, okay, this thing belongs to or is a part of that other thing that is not given immediately in experience. And so this is just to go back and reaffirm, Leigh, your point. Judgment would only pertain to something which is not given in experience.
I mean, we're all sounding very German here, right? In our discussion of judgment. this is going to be a gross and ham-handed way of dividing history of philosophy discussions of judgment. But I think that we could say in general that ancient and medieval thinkers primarily saw judgment as tied to, let's say, truth and correspondence.
Right.
In the Enlightenment, you've got the rationalists who are going to focus on the application of reason, while the empiricists are going to highlight the dependence on experience.
Yeah.
But then in the 19th century, we have the emergence of German idealists who are talking about judgment and really its role in synthesizing concepts. That's going to get even more complicated in the 20th century. The phenomenologists come along and they're going to tie judgment to intentionality and lived experience. And then the analytic philosophers are going to come along and analyze the logical structure and the relation to language.
I was sure you were going to say the analytic philosophers come along and analyze the shit out of that.
Yeah, they analyze the absolute shit out of it, yeah. But then the postmodernists come along and they're like, oh, hey, let's just question judgment altogether, right? Like emphasize its contextual and social dimensions.
Right.
So, I mean, again, ham-handed description of the last 2,000 years of philosophy, but it does seem like the three of us right now are kind of settling into this German idealist notion of judgment, which is really about synthesizing concepts.
I mean, I started this with a kind of historical claim that there is no place for something like judgment in Greek philosophy by and large, in medieval philosophy by and large. And that got me to wondering whether the explosion of the notion of judgment in a philosopher like Kant, and then that would feed into the German idealists, is not a result of their picking up Descartes' notion that what goes on subjectively for us is separated or cut off from what goes on objectively in the world. And therefore, we need something like judgment to hook those two things back up together. That is, I'm judging because I don't have direct access to the objective world out there.
Am I wrong in hearing you put forth that what Aristotle calls phronesis is not judgment?
You're not wrong. I am making that claim.
Yeah, I want to quibble.
I also want to quibble.
I want to quibble.
Let's quibble, Devonya.
Even though Aristotle is not pulling out practical wisdom or phronesis in the same formulation that German idealism is going to pull it apart from lived experience and what I come to know directly through reason, I do feel like phronesis and discernment and those ethical moves that I have to make with respect to practical wisdom are a kind of judging. I think Aristotle does use discernment or something akin to discernment because I have to move around the pieces and see if they apply. I have to go beyond the immediate experience and understand how things are going to apply in that particular circumstance. And it's not simply a recollection or a reconnection with knowledge that I already had, as it would have been for Plato, right? Aristotle is really saying I'm engaged in doing something that is a particular virtue and skill that I develop in practical wisdom.
And you have to understand the relationship between the immediate, experiential, particular context and the so-called universal rule.
Right. And I have to do it with a certain kind of moderation, and there are all these parameters, and it's something that I improve over time. So this idea of judgment moving beyond what's given in immediate experience also aligns with somebody like Hannah Arendt. Thinking and judgment are linked. We begin to understand judgment then not simply as a cognitive capacity, but also as a skill.
Right.
As something that we cultivate and develop over time. And I do want to see that linked to the ancients as well.
So 3 points I want to make to
Holy
that.
shit. He's calling in with a whole lecture.
Yes, but you're making me work hard.
3 points, each of which has 2 subpoints.
And the first subpoint has 7 subpoints.
There's so many lemmas in this point that he's making.
So my first point is I want to stick with something you said at the beginning, Devonya, because as someone who is primarily a historian of philosophy, this is like my, what is that called? My bugbear? Like
your
the
hobby
thing
horse.
Yeah, my hobby horse. it's not just that Aristotle doesn't use the term judgment. It's that we need to think, what might it be about his philosophy on account of which he does not see a need for something like judgment? And I want to hold that open and say, well, maybe phronesis certainly is a kind of knowing, but it's perhaps not a kind of knowing that requires judgment. Now, I think there are clues to this in the ethics itself, where he shows how phronesis is and is not related to both Sophia, wisdom in a more general sense,
right?
Knowledge of first principles and so on, and then nous, on the other hand, which is sometimes translated as intuition, but is what he defines there as knowledge of the ultimate in both directions, a universal and a particular, in which case, if my doctor says my cholesterol is high and I should avoid red meat, when I see a chicken walking in front of me, I don't need to judge that's white meat. I will say phronize it. That is, it's something other than judgment going on there. It's a form of thinking that is not the same as judgment.
Because I know what it is?
Because I know what it is. I know what rule applies here. Yeah. And that's why the phronemos, the one who has phronesis, looks an awful lot like one who merely has experience. The one who merely has experience, or a lot of experience, Aristotle wouldn't say they're making a judgment. It's a kind of knowing that doesn't require judgment.
But I think you're skipping the operative moment here. The operative moment is not that I identify a chicken as white meat. The operative moment is that I identify a chicken as white meat and I make the judgment I ought not eat it.
Can I also throw in here that the rapidity with which I make this discernment, or the speed at which I make that discernment, gets increased the more experience I have, right? And that is this process of habituation, that in effect I am practicing a process of discernment that makes me more efficient in my application of the universal to the particular.
Yeah, I agree. And it's the emphasis Aristotle has on habituation in the ethics that I think flies in the face of phronesis being a judgment. Because one of the main things about the ethics is we need to be habituated in virtue. Why do we need to be habituated in virtue? I'll take Leigh's example. We don't make the judgment that white meat is healthy. Medical science knows that white meat is healthy. I make the judgment that I need to eat this meat in order to be healthy, if I make a judgment at all. But what I'm saying is, for Aristotle, I don't even need judgment there.
Yeah, but is that because I take my doctor as authoritative? Even with habituation, there is space in which I've got to wrestle with my forms of discernment. And granted, for Aristotle, habituation is something that I learn and develop in the company of people who hopefully are virtuous if I'm going to achieve virtue. But there is this process, because at a certain point, I have to choose it for its own sake in order for it to be virtuous. It can't simply be that I follow the rule that I've been given. And I think you raise a great question. What, at the time that Aristotle was writing, was at play that meant that he didn't need judgment in the same way that the German idealists take up judgment? I think that's a great question. And yet I am still not willing to concede there isn't something akin to judgment going on in practical wisdom, or in the activity of the person we're going to call wise, or the person that we're going to want to follow toward virtue.
Let me just be clear. When I said the science of medicine, I meant their science in Aristotle's sense, in which there would be a demonstrative syllogism, the conclusion of which is white meat is healthy. And that would be known by a doctor, that is someone who does the science of medicine.
Right.
Now, the problem then is, as it were, correlating that with my life and the messiness of my actions and so on. And there might be a moment where something like judgment would come in, but I want to pause for a second and say, what baggage are we bringing to Aristotle when we say that it's judgment?
I want to put the what baggage are we bringing to Aristotle question aside, because obviously a lot. But I just want to note for the record that science itself is judgment. That's what the whole field is. It's not just recording of sensory perceptions. I mean, I think I might agree with Devonya here that if part of what your example is demonstrating is that because I trust science, then I'm not making a judgment when I don't eat red meat or whatever, or when I do eat white meat. The trusting of science is itself a judgment, and science is itself a science of judgment.
All right, I should have been even more clear. So the term that I'm using for science translates Aristotle's episteme. Mm-hmm. It's an apodictic syllogism which delivers knowledge. And so for Aristotle, there is no judgment at all. If I say that which is near does not twinkle, the moon is near, therefore the moon does not twinkle, there's no judgment there. Because for Aristotle, if I look at the two premises of that syllogism, it's not that I judge that this particular is a particular of this universal. For Aristotle, that's a capacity called nous, which is not judgment. I sort of grasp it.
I get that, but I think this is where maybe your example is not well suited here, because eating white meat is healthier than eating red meat. That's not the same thing as saying all bachelors are unmarried men. It's not syllogistic. It does involve a judgment.
What I'm saying is it may belong to the science of medicine as a conclusion, which would have been demonstrated. Since I'm not a practitioner of the science of medicine, I can't formulate that syllogism, but it might be, if it is a science, then it is a demonstrated conclusion.
Is this a way of parsing what Kant thinks of as a priori knowledge versus a posteriori? In other words, I'm apprehending something through the syllogism that I'm coming to know by virtue of reason, but not experience. I'm trying to figure out how you're parsing that differently so that it sidesteps judgment.
I guess what I'm saying is that I think there's an entirely different context within which Kant is thinking, such that the category of judgment becomes really important in ways that it isn't for Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or Averroes or Julian of Norwich or Aristotle or Socrates. Mm-hmm. There's something about the context in which Kant is thinking. There is a question for which judgment is the answer. That isn't a question in philosophers prior in the history of philosophy in the West.
Enjoying the conversation? Let's connect. Whether you're in the mood for a spicy debate or just want to say hi, we're all over the internet. Find us on Facebook at Hotel Bar Sessions Podcast, on Twitter and Blue Sky at Hotel Bar Podcast, and catch our latest videos on YouTube and TikTok at Hotel Bar Sessions. Want even more? Our website, hotelbarpodcast.com, is your one-stop shop for all things Hotel Bar Sessions. Follow us, tag us, and join the fun. So we've been trying to assess what judgment is as a term, and now maybe we want to move toward thinking about, in particular, moral judgment. Do we need to make judgments when we think about ethics?
Yes.
Okay, well judged. When I was thinking about how these different spheres in which we talk about judgment have something in common, I started wondering, is there some fuzziness where we feel like we need judgment? So to go back to Devonya, your example of, it's cloudy, but is it going to rain? I say that I need judgment there because the facts aren't clear or they're not entirely clear. There's kind of a messiness here. If that's the case, then I think ethics is a space par excellence where there's incredible fuzziness. There's incredible fuzziness because we are finite beings. We can't know everything. We can't know the outcome of all of our actions. Our understanding is clouded by our emotions. So it turns out that within what is good and bad, that is the sphere of ethics, I think this is a space of incredible fuzziness, and therefore judgment seems most of all required in something like ethics.
And if I could just add to that, I think the fuzziness is not about For example, whether or not when it's cloudy today, it's going to rain.
Right.
That is a kind of fuzziness that is about probabilities and probably could be figured out. But rather, there's a particular circumstance, and whatever the universal that this particular is supposed to be subsumed under is not already given.
Right.
So it's not a given that when it's cloudy, it's going to rain. The fuzziness there is about how things are going to happen in between when it starts to be cloudy and when it rains or doesn't rain.
Right.
The fuzziness in a moral judgment is that we've got a particular situation and it's not clear from my sensory perceptions to say this is bad or this is good, right? Like if I witness a murder, what I witness is someone stabbing someone and the second person dying. I don't witness evil. I don't witness badness. I don't witness any thought. And so I have to posit the universal under which the particular is going to be subsumed. That's a different way of thinking about what judgment requires, which is both reflective and positive.
Positive in the sense that it posits the universal.
Positing, yeah.
As you were saying that, Leigh, I was thinking about Devonya's earlier example of Aunt May and lying. And this is flying in the face of Kant, but we've discussed Kant on lying multiple times in the past. But there's a situation in which, as Devonya put the example, I'm not sure whether the rule, you shall not lie, applies here or not. Rather, is there another rule like respect your elders that trumps the you shall not lie rule?
Or compassion.
Or compassion, yeah. That requires judgment.
Right. In terms of how one applies the rule. I remember when I took a job as an administrator and I was told that there's no difficulty in applying the rule. The real work of the job is knowing when to make an exception. And to me, that speaks to the work of judgment, especially when we're thinking about moral judgment. When do we invoke a different rule? When do we look for the case that is different? I'm also wondering if, when we think about structures of power, which seems to be my bailiwick, that other ways of determining what rules are at work come to the fore, right? So if I'm existing in a white supremacist structure that devalues certain forms of life, then my judgments about what is called for in an ethical sense are going to be non-standard judgments, and they're going to come to me from a different way of apprehending or analyzing and interpreting the situation.
So I've got to say, I really struggle with this a lot because I don't think the judgment, this is an appropriate exception to the rule, is the same thing as the judgment, there is another rule that applies here. I think when I make a judgment, what under normal circumstances would be a subsumption of this particular situation under a universal rule, when this particular situation is an exception to that rule, I don't necessarily think that requires me positing another rule. That is actually kind of one of the beautiful things about judgment, is it doesn't necessarily just replace a scientific understanding with another scientific understanding. That moral understanding is really something of an entirely different ilk, right? Like as they say in The Wizard of Oz, it's a horse of a different color. Right? Like we're doing something totally different here. And the doing something totally different here requires a lot of things that science doesn't require. I mean, for Kant, it requires presuming teleology, presuming freedom, a certain kind of purposiveness, none of which science requires to apply a universal rule to a particular situation. So I struggle sometimes with the idea that in order to make an exception to a rule, morally speaking, another rule that justifies the exception has to be posited. I think that we just end up in a nonsensical morass if we say that.
Right.
We're not going to get out of it. And many people use that as a way of more or less justifying anything that they do.
Right. But I wonder if there are some cases in which what we call making an exception is actually recognizing or judging that a different rule applies here.
Yeah.
And then there are other cases in which we just say, you know what, I'm judging not to apply rules at all. So I think of a presidential pardon. A presidential pardon seems to me to be not saying, I'm now applying a different rule than the one that was applied at trial. A presidential pardon is saying, I'm deciding that the rule doesn't apply.
Or there is no rule.
Right. That's what I mean.
Or there is no universal. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road in morality, right? Yeah. Often we find ourselves in situations where the complexities of the particular situation simply cannot be subsumed by a rule. Period. Right. And so we have to make a judgment, and that requires, as Devonya has been repeating, a certain kind of discernment that respects the universal rule, respects the universal law, and is also intelligently attentive to the particular circumstances.
Yeah. And I like the idea of respecting the universal as an acknowledgement that there is an awareness of universal principles, even if I determine that doesn't apply here, or this rule doesn't serve well. And maybe when I think about proposing an alternative rule, I'm thinking about a kind of logic or rationality that is guiding my discernments in these ways, right? So maybe it is not, strictly speaking, a rule or a kind of recipe that tells me what I need to do, but it is that understanding that this is an exception case, that I am working with some coherent process, a kind of logic that leads me to the judgment that result. And I guess I'm trying to account for that in a way that is not too beholden to certain presumptions about truth and rationality.
I think that's such a good point. I mean, the example that immediately comes to mind is, how do I judge who is a good friend? I mean, friendship is so particular, right? Like, what makes a good friend, what makes each friend a good friend is so particular to them, to you, to the particular relationship between the two of you, and quite simply cannot be formulated as a rule that was going to apply to other friendships. It requires a certain kind of understanding of the relationship between the universal, one ought to befriend good friends, and the particular, this friend is someone I ought to befriend. But the application, the subsumption of that particular under the universal is going to be different in every friendship. It's going to require discernment, what I think we're calling judgment.
What I find important about recognizing the universal while also holding the importance of the particular is that it fits in with a situation in which we don't even know the consequences of all of our actions. I have a particular example in mind. If you think about invasive species, here I'm thinking animal rather than plant. Now, sometimes the solution is to bring in another non-indigenous species in order to take care of the invasive species, only then to be overrun by the species you brought in. And so what ended up being perhaps a correct action to achieve a general rule turns out to not achieve that general rule. One might have said, you know what? Had you thought about it a little bit longer? In other words, maybe you ought to have exercised better judgment. And I think there, the case is my actions are something that, although I'm the author of them, once I enact them, out they go in the world, and they have rippling effects that I am no longer in control of.
I appreciate the implicit Bayesianism of this formulation, because it's like you should have predicted the probabilities better. And of course, if you're going to start with the statement that you cannot see the future, then you can only predict probabilities better or worse.
Yeah.
And now skipping from the ancients through the medievals, through the Enlightenment period, all the way to the 20th century, I think that we realize that this is just the case, right? That we can't accurately probabilize lived experience in a way that even approximates science, much less morality.
And that those ambiguities call us, we have to take action despite the ambiguities of having a full or complete understanding of the result of our actions, right? So when we were opening this segment asking, do we need judgment in ethics? I think it is precisely because of the ambiguity of action that we do need judgment. We also need to develop the skill in addition to the capacity of judging. So how do we become good judges rather than just being judgy?
I completely agree with that. And if we could just bring this all the way up to the 20th century, one of the things I love the most about Derrida's formulation of deconstruction is that it is entirely centered on what he calls the decision. And he never really talks about it as a judgment, but it clearly is. It's a decision that has to be made in a particular situation, in a lived experience that is undecidable, to use Derrida's terms, is incalculable. But we face this every day in our lives. We can't see the future. We don't necessarily have a rule to apply here. And yet a decision has to be made. What motivates, what forms that decision? It has to be something like what we've been talking about, namely judgment. And it's not here judgment in the sense of science. It's not really even judgment in the sense of Kant's aesthetic or moral judgment. It's just a kind of fiat decision, right? That like, I'm going to put my foot down here. And it's only ex post facto that it can be determined as a good judgment or a bad judgment.
I don't know. I want to push, it's a fiat decision in the sense that I must take action. But I really want to lean into the idea that we are cultivating an ability to make those choices or those judgments in the face of ambiguity, and that there are certain kinds of things that make us better at it and worse at it, right? And here I don't want to talk about efficiency, because I don't think it's simply a matter of efficiency as much as it is a matter of successful ethical judgments and the means by which we judge those within a world that is filled with ambiguities.
I like the way that you're formulating this, because it reminds me of what I say to my students often when we're doing, the trolley problem or any other ethical dilemma, which is that the worst time to start thinking about your moral sensibilities is when that trolley's actually fucking coming down the track, right? Like you want to start thinking about these before it actually happens. And I think this is what, in general, in civilian terms, as Rick says, we mean by good judgment, is someone who has thought in advance of maybe not all possible situations, but has thought, if I ever find myself in a dilemma, that this is going to be my inclination. Like, given a situation in which I cannot apply a rule and it's not obvious what the right decision is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to err in this direction, right?
Right.
I remember, what was it? I mean, it's probably 10 years ago now, when the Trump administration was trying to basically do away with the DREAM Act, the Dreamers.
Yeah.
And I remember saying to one of my colleagues, if ICE ever came to our campus and came to my classroom, I do believe that I would stand in between ICE officers and my dreamer students. Now, would I actually do that? Who knows? It never happened. But I thought about it in advance and I made the judgment. This is what I'm going to do if that situation never happened.
But if I can, I think there's an analogy between what we do here in the hotel bar. Bear with me on this. So I hate to break it to our listeners, but we are not each experts in every single thing we talk about.
Bite your tongue.
And yet we can have conversations because we have done some thinking that gives us preparation. We've exercised some muscles that allow us to do this kind of work now, even though we've never done it exactly on topic X or Y. And I think judgment is something like that. I don't need to have thought about trolleys killing one person versus 5 people in order to have good judgment were that situation to present it to me. I do have to have thought about, is one life less valuable or more valuable than 5 lives?
Right.
Is my intervening make me culpable morally or not? Which I can think about in all sorts of situations such that, and this goes back to Devonya's notion of habituation, I just sort of go on muscle memory.
I think that's such a good example. And I actually think that this is at the heart of what is going to be one of the biggest issues in technology in the next 2 years, namely what's called the alignment problem. So how do we align the operation of AI systems with human values? That is not an engineering question.
Right.
That's not a coding question. That is a question about values. And I'm not an engineer. I can't build a LLM. But what I can do is I can say, hey, I've thought a lot about how to align AI systems with human values. That's where ethicists are necessary.
Right.
And by ethicists, I mean people with good judgment.
Right.
And also people who have insights into things that are not necessarily obvious or that don't necessarily appear immediately to one's perception or apprehension of what's going on. I mean, the ability to see around the corner and think about the implications of doing things a certain way. Like, who decided to use infrared as the mechanism that's going to start water in dispensers in rest stop bathrooms, right? So as a Black person, infrared visual takes up the pigmentation in my skin differently. And someone made a judgment about what mechanism to use based on the information that was available to them or the perception of the world that they were operating under without going, oh, how might this affect melanated people when they go to try and get water? And I think there is the alignment problem with values, but there is also, for me, and this is where I think judgment becomes crucial, what is it that I don't know and I can't know in this circumstance that I need to be considering? And I agree that that's where ethicists and people who are not always a part of the conversation come in. And I think as much as people poo-poo these sort of canned ideas of diversity, there's something important about having people from different viewpoints and different experiences thinking about problems, because there are certain things that come into view that allow us to better think about these problems.
And just to tie then all of that together, at the very moment where universities, often under pressure from the general public, are shutting down humanities departments and diversity initiatives, you, Devonya, just pointed out a concrete example, and Leigh, another concrete example of how short-sighted that is in brute economic terms.
Yeah, and just to put a bow on this, it is the case that it's not just in technology, it's in business, it's in university operations, it's in healthcare. Every forum of human activity needs actually trained ethicists. And by trained ethicists, I mean people who have been trained in determining what judgments are better or worse judgments. And that's not the same thing as saying people who are trained in telling you what is good or bad, or what is right or wrong.
Right.
That's the important thing. Like, to say that we need to train or hone people's capacities for making good judgments is not the same thing as saying, I need to tell everybody, as we often see, we always see in our DEI trainings or our equal opportunity trainings, you know, it's like, can I slap my secretary on the ass? No, you can't, right? That's not what you need ethicists for. What you need ethicists for is to bring back to the level of collaborative discussion, what is the alignment between what it is that we're trying to do and the values that we're trying to uphold?
Right. And do we need to come up with different values? I mean, do we need a different direction?
Also the job of ethicists.
Yes, I'm adding on to this idea of what ethicists are doing, because I don't think it's only adjudicating whether or not we're doing what we've said we're going to do or valuing what we've asserted we're going to value well. It is also asking whether or not these things are genuinely of value in the ways that we believe them to be.
Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Leigh. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar. Leigh, earlier you referred to Kant's notion of aesthetic judgment, and for our civilian audience members, I just wanted to circle back because I think that's another area in which we talk an awful lot about judgment. So what Leigh was referring to by aesthetic judgment, at least for Kant and most people who work in the area of aesthetics, is a judgment that something is beautiful or ugly. It's sometimes referred to as a judgment of taste. And so when you, for example, listen to a song and you're like, oh, this is a great song, that's a judgment. And what's interesting about my formulation, this is a great song, is notice I say this as if it were a fact. Kant is very interested in that fact-like quality that these judgments have. It's not like, in my opinion, this is beautiful or it's beautiful for me, but I say, no, this is a great song.
Right. And there are ways in which I can say this is a great song because I like it and know that it is not a great song for all people. I kind of think of something like Killer Clowns from Outer Space, which is a great cult movie, but I don't know that I would call it a great movie for all people. So in that respect, I would not be making an aesthetic judgment in Kant's sense, right? That I like this movie for reasons that are unique to me. So it's not an aesthetic judgment. It's a matter of taste.
But I think what's interesting about when I say this is a great song, which is similar to when I say this is good, is that I don't mean this is a great song in my opinion. I mean, you also ought to think that this is a great song,
right?
Or you also ought to think that this is good. That's one of the things that I think is really interesting about judgment. We do have this ability to posit our judgments as if they are universal, right? Like as if they have a normative valence to them, as if you also ought to subsequently apply all of your particulars under this rule that I've just stated to you. And I think that that is one of the things that people get really hung up on about judgment. People want to say, oh, but that's just your opinion. You can't state it as a universal. But if you have a friend that says, this Taylor Swift song is a great song, and I say, this Bob Dylan song is a great song, so I'm just stipulating that Taylor Swift fans and Bob Dylan fans are probably monumentally different music fans.
But I'm guessing you're a fan of both of them.
That's because I'm special. But the point here is that they're saying the exact same thing.
Right.
And so even if I, as a Taylor Swift fan, don't appreciate Bob Dylan, or you as a Bob Dylan fan don't appreciate Taylor Swift, we both appreciate the judgment, this is a great song.
I think this is because of two issues that have come up a few times in our discussion, but we haven't really hit them, and they're fundamentally related. The first is, Leigh, you mentioned earlier that moral judgment is in relation to an ought. And so it's saying that this is the way things ought to be. I understand the world is messy and that sometimes things don't work out, but this is the way the world ought to be. Now, how do I get to that ought? It's because of another term that both you and Devonya have used in this conversation, namely value. This is something that is valued, or maybe this is something that everyone ought to value. And so when I say this is a great song, part of what I'm saying is this is what a song ought to be. And therefore, I'm saying it has certain characteristics or form or, I don't know, harmonic structure that are what songs ought to be. Now, there might be other examples that are also ways in which songs ought to be, but I think the values and the judging that the real world is perhaps not as it ought to be is part of this question of judgment.
And can also say that when we disagree about particular matters of judgment, like this is beautiful, we are weirdly agreeing in our capacity to judge, like in our capacity to make aesthetic judgments. One of the weird things about aesthetic judgments is that we kind of assume that this is beautiful for me. This was meant to be pleasurable for me. Therefore, the world has some kind of teleological purpose built into it that includes, for example, presenting beauty, presenting pleasure to me. And so even if we disagree about the particular things that are beautiful or that are great songs or that are, I don't know, important artworks or movements or even values, it nevertheless is the case that what we're sharing is a kind of what Kant called sensus communis.
Right.
An idea that we belong to a community of valuers that nevertheless approach the world in the same way, presuming a kind of freedom about making these judgments and also presuming a kind of purposiveness of the world.
And it's also interesting that while you might say this is beautiful and I say no, it's not, that's an entirely different matter than you're saying this is beautiful and my saying there is no such thing as beauty.
Exactly.
And I want to jump in here because I think it is important to our conversation to note that for Kant, there is a kinship between aesthetic judgment and moral judgment. And
Sure.
It lingers around this idea of us being in a community of valuers. If I can judge beauty, then I can also make moral judgments, right? And this relies upon a particular sensibility, let's call it, or unique kind of feeling that Kant won't call exactly pleasure, but he refers to as reverence for these values. And it still makes me a little nudgy.
Nudgy? Wait, I'm going to need a definition there of nudgy.
Well, let me say a little bit about what makes me nudgy in this. It is not the idea that we can judge beauty or somehow there is a relationship to our valuing beauty and valuing the good. I'm not nudgy about those connections. I'm much more nudgy about what it means to build a community around the sense that I can have a universal way of coming to that brings me together as part of a community. And that's not to say that I oppose being part of a community or that I deny that communities come together under shared values. It is this idea of what's at stake when I'm working out the overall values for the community, or what the Jesuits might call working out the common good.
I mean, isn't what's at stake that you're coexistent in a world with other free agents, other agents capable of judging?
I agree, but I'm also uneasy about our capacity to give power to those kinds of judgments that seem out of alignment with what the majority are doing, right? When I say this is beautiful or this is good, I may be setting up things that I judge to be good or ethical that in fact are good and ethical for only certain people and excluding others, right?
I completely agree with you. I just want to say I would take that over I exist in a world without free agents.
Agreed. I do not want to take away the idea that part of judging involves a freedom to be engaged in thought and discernment.
Yeah.
Without immediate coercion, let's say.
Right. And I do think that, as Nietzsche pointed out, we need to be aware of how even the very terms we have for values, like that's noble and even beautiful, are related to the ruling class of any given society. And so often terms like beautiful or good carry with them unmarked signifiers like that's white, that's male, and so on.
Pumpkin spice.
And that's where we come all the way back to the 21st century.
I agree that somehow a world in which there is pumpkin spice is not a world that ought to be.
Ooh, bold statement.
That is bold for all those pumpkin spice lovers.
You know, that's fine. It just doesn't have to be everywhere. But also, Devonya, you're questioning, I would turn it sort of in the opposite direction. Namely, isn't it the case that communities are formed precisely on the basis of judgments of value? I come into community with people whose values I share, whose judgments then I also trust or consider to be good judgments. And this is in many ways how communities are formed.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think there is no communities without judging agents, just to use entirely, Enlightenment terms here. I don't think that communities are formed by people who are entirely limited, for example, by the expanse of their sense perceptions.
Yes.
Or governed by tautologies entirely.
But I guess I want to then, if we're hanging out in the Enlightenment, extend our understanding of who can be a judging agent.
Which is itself a judgment.
Right. And I think the question in aligning communities is not so much are we developing collectives via shared senses of value as much as who gets to participate as a judging agent and be taken seriously as a judging agent. Questions of epistemic injustice and epistemic oppression.
That formulation reminds me of something that we discussed several seasons ago when Jason Reed was one of our co-hosts. I think he was referencing a Dr. Seuss book. I'm not sure which one it was, but the idea that, we don't want to only exist in a society where there are judgers who judge everyone else, right? We also want to be judgers of the judgers, but then of course you need judgers of those judgers and judgers of those judgers, and then it becomes turtles all the way down.
And can I just say that the phrase judging agent sounds like something Mark Zuckerberg tried to write code for when he was in college?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, our bartender is giving us last call. She also, like Rick, cannot live in this PSL world, and she's going to send us home. But before we get out of here, I just want to give both of you a moment for very brief final thoughts. Rick, how about you?
I just want to say one thing we didn't mention, but I find very interesting is the notion that history judges and that, certain things are now seen as failed in the judgment of history.
Devonya?
Well, I always wonder if history is judging or if we are reassessing what we thought we did when we judged in that historical moment. And I think I want to put in a plug for the cultivation of good judgment.
Leigh, what about you?
I mean, I just want to say that as predicted, we might reach AGI, artificial general intelligence, this year. It's very important to remember that AI is entirely capable of judging in the sense of judging that we used all the way up to the 19th century, but not in the 20th century. The idea of judgment requiring lived experience and the critical examination of social and political structures is really not a capacity of AGI. That is something that is going to continue to require human judgment. So, just hang on to that, humans.
Well, last call is a universal, and the bartender judges this is a particular instance of it. So I'll catch you all later.
Take care.
Yeah, bye, guys.